The nightmare began 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. I had just come back to our seats from the toilet with my 5-year-old son. It all happened quickly. I reckon most passengers didn't even see the Cessna that appeared out of nowhere. They just felt our plane's steep turn to avoid a collision. I, however, saw the smaller aircraft swish past us, just a few meters away from crashing right into us. Being a pilot myself, I knew something wasn't right about this, especially not at this altitude. My hands were shaking from the close call, but the rest of the passengers, including my husband, only chuckled nervously. They didn't realize that we had just been seconds from certain death. Tim sensed how worried I was and begged me to explain what had just happened. I tried to comfort him the best I could while also trying to get a hold of one of the flight attendants to get some answers. "Where did that business jet come from?" I asked. "That was extremely dangerous." I was interrupted by strong turbulence. The flight attendant almost fell to the floor, but she managed to remain standing by holding on to my husband's seat. The seatbelt sign turned on, followed by the clicking sound of everyone strapping themselves in. "Ma'am," the attendant said, and ignored my concerns. "Please put your seatbelt on." "It's nothing to worry about," my husband said as he put on his seatbelt. "Relax." He laughed. "You know, out of all people, I didn't think you would be afraid of a little turbulence." "We almost died, Robert," I growled. "My God." The captain finally addressed the passengers. "We are having some problem with the navigation." The co-pilot could be heard in the background, whispering something with a concerned voice. A small discussion between them erupted, seemingly agitated, followed by an "Oh my God," before the pilot spoke again. "Prepare for an emergency landing." I helped Tim put on his seatbelt, fearing the worst, and then looked out the window. It was hard to see anything. It looked like we were flying through a gray overcast, which should have been impossible given how clear it had been outside just moments ago. Black raindrops struck the window, leaving brownish trails behind them as they blew to the side. This was all wrong. Tim wanted me to hold him, but there was no way for him to reach me from his seat. He kept asking if we were going to crash, something I had spent days convincing him wouldn't happen. Now I wasn't so sure anymore, but even so, I told him no, of course not. And we didn't, but I no longer know if that was a good thing. The plane touched down on a runway and slowly rolled into an impressively large metropolitan airport. "Phew," my Robert said, and rested his hand on Tim's shoulder. "What a relief, huh? We made it." I must admit, I became a little worried myself there for a moment. "There's just one problem," I said. "Where are we?" The screen showing our current location had turned off, and even though I knew most large airports in the country, I couldn't recognize any of the structures outside the window, and there shouldn't have been any airports of this size anywhere close to where we were anyway. "This is the captain speaking," came from the PA, followed by a long pause. "So, just a small update on our situation. Earlier, we had to make an evasive maneuver to avoid a collision with a smaller aircraft. That was the sharp turn you experienced. After that, we found ourselves in some bad weather conditions, resulting in turbulence, and the power went out. Fortunately, we saw this runway and managed a forced landing. We're still out of power at the moment, but we're hoping someone will assist us soon. Please remain in your seats until further notice, and thank you for your cooperation." And we waited and waited and waited. Just like everyone else, I tried to get a glimpse of what was going on outside the plane. I couldn't figure out the reason why a fully operating airport as big as LAX, from what I could tell, wouldn't immediately come to our rescue. The lights were clearly on inside the buildings, so there was no reason to assume that no one was there. And yet, no one came. I tried to spot movement inside the windows of the terminal and the control tower through the gray fog and dirty drizzle, but aside from a flickering fluorescent light here and there, I saw nothing. "What's going on, Mom?" my son said. "Why aren't they letting us out?" It was at that moment the pilots must have given up their attempts at getting in touch with the controllers. They both came out from the cockpit, pale and sweaty behind their fragile facade of confidence, and instructed two of the flight attendants to open the emergency exit and inflate the evacuation slide. It was finally time to leave the airplane. My husband took our luggage while I carried Tim, whispering into his ear that everything was going to be all right. And up until this point, I really believed that, but nothing could have been further from the truth. At first, I couldn't tell what it was that made everything feel off outside, but then it dawned on me. There were no winds. The air was just as still as you would have expected inside a poorly ventilated room. It brought about the uncanny sensation of being inside and outside at the same time, an unnatural experience only enlarged by the dark rain pattering against the pavement, and the tepid, motionless atmosphere carried with it a musty odor that brought to mind the furthest reaches of a cave. The buildings appeared as dark silhouettes inside the oppressive fog, even though we stood quite close to them, and the only thing that could be seen further away was indistinct shapes of dark, treeless hills. Needless to say, this was by far the most desolate place I've ever had the misfortune to end up in. Among the concerned whispers around us, my husband yelled hello. The echo traveled into the fog, but not much farther. The crew remained in authority, even though they were equally lost as the rest of us, and led us to the doors to the baggage reclaim area. A young man helped my husband with one of our bags when he saw him struggling. We exchanged a few words with him. He was on his way home from spring break after some heavy partying. It was the kind of encounter that you wouldn't remember, but because of how things progressed from here, this particular incident has etched itself on my memory. I have come to hate that young man, even though he didn't really do anything wrong. At first, we couldn't get the doors opened, which caused unease to spread among us. After all, this place didn't just induce dread in me, but in all of us. A few people banged on the doors, while another group, friends by the look of it, decided to separate from the rest of us in an attempt to find another entrance. That's when it happened. One of them was the young man, and he still had our bag in his hands. My husband ran after him, even though I yelled at him that it wasn't important, and disappeared around the corner. A few moments later, 3 of the friends opened the door for us from the inside. My husband was nowhere to be seen. "Where are the rest?" the co-pilot asked. "Did you find anyone else?" "Where is Robert?" I asked. "My husband, he ran up to you and—" "We got separated on the way back," one of them said. "Something caught their attention. Some kind of noise, I think. We looked for them for hours, but—" "That doesn't make any sense," an elderly lady protested. "You just left moments ago." Nothing made sense here, I thought. "They're still here somewhere," the captain said. "We'll find them." It was just as empty inside. I would go as far as to say completely lifeless, but not as silent. There was the buzzing from the lights in the ceiling, the humming from the soda machines, the whir from the ventilation, and the repetitive rumbling from an escalator nearby. This airport wasn't closed. It was, for lack of a better word, abandoned. Although it felt just as if it had never been occupied in the first place, that it had always been like this, forever locked inside the everlasting gloom outside. "My legs hurt," my son complained. "I'm tired of walking." I picked him up and held him tight as we wandered through the airport. It became more and more apparent that there was no one here besides us. It was all vacant, the check-in desks, the cafes, the shops, and the gates. The terminal stretched out in front of us like a giant cave of steel. Large windows, meant to let the sunlight inside, now only kept the gray murk outside. I yelled my husband's name as soon as we entered a new room, but to no avail. and my son continued to cry about the pain in his legs. We sat down at a cafe. It was time for us to acknowledge what everyone had already whispered to their closest, that this place, not just the airport but the world outside as well, was beyond our comprehension. A middle-aged man, loosening up his tie, finally spoke the words, "This place isn't natural." He finally removed his tie and threw it at the floor. I kept my eye on the screen showing our position. We were nowhere near land. This place, I'm telling you, it shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be here. No one should. I mean, I don't know. He fell silent for a moment. I don't think we're anywhere on Earth. Purgatory, the elderly woman whispered under her breath. I bet we actually collided with that small airplane, and this airport is nothing more and nothing less than a divine symbolic representation of the way station between heaven and hell. My son cried out of pain. "Mommy, please, Mommy." He kicked with his legs in agony, vainly trying to escape the ache. "Make it stop, please. Mommy." I realized that he wasn't just tired from walking. It was something else. But not even a man who claimed he was a doctor could see anything wrong with his legs. He said it was probably growing pains, and thus nothing to worry about, but that he would need to give him an X-ray to rule out anything else. Which was, of course, impossible. After a while, Tim thankfully calmed down, and I kissed his sweaty forehead with a smile of relief. "I don't think this is the afterlife," one of the friends said, and pointed at my son. "What sins would a small child have to atone for? This is something else entirely. Some kind of glitch in the Matrix, you know what I mean? I think this airport got stuck here just like us. Although I guess we would have heard about an entire airport vanishing. But still, I'm convinced this is just some random interdimensional twaddle." The captain, the man we had come to look up to in these dire circumstances, broke down in tears in front of us. One of the flight attendants laid her hands around him, doing her best to comfort him. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Don't blame the rest of the crew. I ordered them not to say anything. I just didn't want you to panic. But we saw it. There was no time to avoid it." "Avoid what?" the man who had discarded his tie asked. "What did you see?" "It's hard to explain," the captain said. "It was like a gray line. A thin, one-dimensional line suspended in the air. It appeared right in front of us after we turned to avoid the other plane. And the moment we flew into it, well, that's when we ended up here. We didn't see much through the windows. It was like flying through a never-ending rain cloud, and then we saw the faint lights coming from the runway. So, you're right. This isn't Earth. As to what it is, my guess is as good as yours." Two of the flight attendants, who up until now had put all hope in their captain knowing what to do, sobbed gently. I thought about my son and what would become of him if we never managed to escape our empty prison. And I thought of Robert, about where he might have ended up and if I would ever see him again. But it didn't make much sense that I wouldn't, so I tried not to worry. He was here somewhere. I knew it. Hunger became an issue, and although some of us were skeptical of the idea, it was decided that we would eat the food on display in the cafe. As far as we knew, it could have been there forever, but after much hesitation, before anyone dared take the first bite, we discovered that it was nothing wrong with it. We continued to look for the others. Tim cried and cried. He was still in pain. I held him close and grabbed his little restless legs to stop him from kicking. But there was nothing I could do. He cried for his father. By now, he knew that he was gone. We spent hours going from empty room to empty room until we found each and every one of them. That's when we had to accept that the others, including the love of my life, had in fact disappeared from the airport. I fell on my knees with my son in my arms, bawling. It was my turn to break down now. The elderly woman touched my shoulder and looked down at me with her old, sunken eyes. "He has started his journey," she said in a comforting voice. "He's been forgiven." We couldn't tell the time. The sun, or whatever it was that produced the gray-tinged light coming down through the endless mist, never set. 1 hour felt like a second like an hour. A few of us joined the old woman in prayer, hoping for the miracle she promised them, while some of us kept on speculating about parallel worlds. But I only tended to my little boy and his aching legs, and I only prayed for him to get better, and for both of us to be reunited with Robert. Not in heaven, but in the flesh. I noticed that my son was slightly taller. I pulled up his trousers, for the second time since the cafe. By now, to my absolute dread, I noticed the stretched marks crawling up his pale skin. The doctor had never seen anything like it before, and could only offer him some of his own painkillers so that my son could sleep. "What is happening to my son?" I cried. No one said a word, and the old woman looked away as if she didn't want to face the kind of suffering her God would never allow. Days became weeks. My son's legs grew out of proportion. Nothing else on his body changed. His skinny legs just kept getting longer and longer and longer. He couldn't walk on his own anymore, and I had to put him inside a luggage car. The pain from the rapid growth came and went. At times he was merely suffering in silence. At other times he screamed himself unconscious, and all I could do was to feed him more and more painkillers, hoping they wouldn't run out too soon. We found a body in a restroom. I recognized it. It was the young man who had helped my husband with the bag. His body was mummified, just as if he had died thousands of years ago. The doctor made the observation that someone had stomped on top of his chest, collapsing the rib cage. He suggested it was the reason behind his demise, but there was no way to be sure. We buried him in the gray mud between the runways, under the never-ending black rain. By now, my son's legs had grown by at least 3 feet. Now and then, a spasm spread through them, making him kick in the air. It was all made worse by the fact that there was no explanation for his condition. It had just snuck up on him out of nowhere and for no reason at all. But I knew it had to do with this place. Somehow, it was the fault of this soul-crushingly despondent plane of existence. At this point, the others avoided getting too close to us. No one said anything, but I could see it behind the pity in their eyes. They were afraid of my son. He was slowly turning into something they all recognized from their nightmares. And they secretly detested, if not him personally, so at least his more and more abhorrent manifestation. But from the perspective of my poor child, what difference did it make? A few days later, or maybe it was weeks, I saw Robert. He was driving a tug across the runway, armed with a metal pipe resembling a lance. I ran outside, but by the time I got there, he was already gone. Still, I was happy. At least as happy as I could be under these downcast circumstances. He was alive. It was just a matter of time, I thought, before we would be reunited. And then came the night my son stood up. We were all sleeping on the blue, fitted carpet in the waiting hall outside of the gates when it happened. I don't know why I woke up at that moment. Perhaps it was my maternal instinct, or perhaps simply the wish of this world. I saw my son, now 12 feet tall, his 5-year-old body balancing on top of his tall legs, as a silhouette against the gray fog outside the windows. I sneaked up to him, trying not to wake the others. "Mom?" he said, looking down at me. "What's happening?" "Are you okay?" I asked. "Doesn't it hurt anymore?" "No," he said, but sobbed nonetheless. "I'm scared." "I know," I said, But it's going to be all right. It's just a matter of time now until Robert finds us. He's out there, and now when you can walk. But Mommy, he whispered between his sobs as he put his hands on the ceiling to support himself. I can't. He paused and tried to hold his tears back. Don't worry, sweetheart. Let's go back to sleep now, and... But that's the thing, Mommy. I can't. Why is that? I asked. What do you mean, love? Because I woke up like this, standing. A chill went down my spine, and then his legs took a few steps. It's not me, Mommy. The doctor woke up. Oh my... He didn't have time to say anything else. My son, or his legs rather, quickly stomped his face in with an unnatural force. The blood erupted from the crater like a fountain, raining down on those sleeping next to him. The room was filled with screams. My son cried on top of his stilt-like legs while they danced around, crushing and piercing everyone who wasn't lucky enough to get away. I didn't want to leave him, and yet I ran with the others. It was just temporary, I thought, so that I could figure out a way to help him. But my son didn't know that. He cried for me, bawling, as the legs walked away with him. From now on, we were hunted, and the melancholy existence we had lived so far turned into a constant terror. I wanted to find something to use to help my son, a saw or some similar tool that I could use to remove the abomination that his legs had become. But all I found was a large carving knife inside a restaurant kitchen. I grabbed it with trembling hands. Somehow, I had to immobilize my son and then use all of my strength to hack his legs off. For that, I needed help, but those who had survived up until now weren't willing. I'm sorry, the captain said. It's too dangerous. He still carried some authority, especially now when he said what everyone wanted to hear, but didn't dare say themselves. I'll help you, the old lady said. Your boy is possessed, and he needs to be freed. I think that is our mission. Those who help him will go to heaven. I hugged her fragile body, grateful for her bravery, but I couldn't imagine in what way she could help me. My only hope was to find my husband. Together with him, there would at least be some hope. Until then, all I could do was follow the others. Mommy! My son yelled between his sobs. Where are you? I'm afraid! He was close, which meant we had to run again. Mommy, he begged, help! But there was nothing I could do. There's nothing worse for a parent than to be useless when they hear their own child call for help. But such was my predicament. I was utterly powerless. All I could do was yell back to him, in the hopes that my voice would give him some shimmer of comfort in his otherwise perilous state. I'm here, my sweet little baby. I'm here, and I love you. I only saw my son whenever he got close enough, when his long and yet still childlike legs carried him toward us in giant leaps. I saw him when his legs caught one of the flight attendants. The captain threw a chair at him to protect her. I yelled for him to wait, to try not to hurt my son in the process, but of course, no one listened to me. My son fell, but the legs crawled forward, dragging him on the floor behind themselves, and caught the young woman like two erratic snakes working in tandem, strangling her so hard we could hear her bones crack inside her body. The captain screamed out in terror as he watched her die with bloodshot eyes staring into nothing. And my son cried as he helplessly tried to crawl away from his own legs. He was only 5. And even though none of this was of his making, I could see the guilt on his innocent face. All the lives lost under his feet weighed down on his until recently spotless conscience. I wanted to hold him. I wanted to whisper in his ear that it wasn't his fault, and I wanted to cut off his damned, cursed legs. I left the group when they began making plans on how to murder my son. The old lady was the only one coming with me. She didn't believe in their utilitarian reasoning. And just like that, they all vanished from the airport, just like my husband had done. At first, I thought that I would never see my son again, that he too had vanished. But then I heard him, like an echo from around the corner, yelling for me. He never appeared, though. We stumbled upon a few bodies. They belonged to the group we had just abandoned. It looked like they had been dead for a long time, maybe more than a year. However, there was very little decomposition. Seeing that there weren't any organisms to feast on the corpses other than the ones already inside them. So it was difficult to tell for how long they had been dead. By now it was clear to me that time didn't move in one direction here. It wasn't a river like back home, but rather a tree. It took another month until we ended up on my husband's branch. It wasn't a happy reunion, even though I was tremendously relieved to finally have him at my side again. My son, now 24 feet tall, fought him and his group in the muddy rain. The captain was with them, unlike the rest of them an old man now, and from the window inside the terminal, I could see that they were trying to fight off my son while entering a smaller airplane that they had somehow managed to get up and running. I didn't want to run down to the exit, fearing I would end up on yet another branch of time, so I threw a chair at the window and climbed down with the help of the old lady. I wanted to embrace my husband, but there was no time. My son cried on top of the legs, looking down at us. "Get on the plane with the others," Robert yelled. "The captain is going to fly us out of here. You don't know for how long He stopped himself. "Just go." I gave him my knife. "You have to tackle him somehow," I said. "We did it once before." And then I paused, unwilling to utter the words. "And then you have to hack his legs off. It's his only chance." I boarded the plane to see who was there, and if there was anything I could do for them. There weren't many of us left. One flight attendant, 2 young men, and the old lady. I asked how she managed to reach the plane before me. Apparently she had taken the stairs and arrived at the runway at an earlier time. She had stepped onto another branch. I cursed myself for not taking the stairs, but of course there was no way for me to have known. I looked out the window. My husband and the captain tried to stave off my son with their long metal pipes. I couldn't even see Tim, just the long legs stomping around. The captain turned to my husband just for a second. That was enough for one of the legs to pierce the side of his head with my son's tiny foot. I knew what it meant, even though I didn't want to acknowledge it even to myself. My husband jumped on the tug. I ran to the door, begging him to come inside. "No!" he yelled, crying. I protested. "Not after I finally found you, please." "I love you," he yelled. "Try to find the shimmering line in the sky." He drove away. My son followed, wobbling on top of the dancing legs as he cried and cried and cried. I wanted to stay behind, to help my family survive. But I was the only hope the others had of ever going back home. Hence, I reluctantly took the helm. I flew in the direction I remembered that we came from. The ground slowly disappeared in the gray fog. There was almost no visibility, and if it weren't for the black rain painting streaks on the windows, it would have looked like we stood perfectly still. After 15 minutes of nothingness in front of me, I began contemplating turning back, but then I finally saw it. The shimmering line. It looked like a one-dimensional rainbow. I steered us right into it. The old lady came up to me, tears running down her face. "You did it," she said. "You're taking us to heaven." But what appeared on the other side weren't angels. It was a Boeing 737 flying straight at us. If I had waited for only a second longer, we would have flown right into it. The Atlantic Ocean glittered in the sunlight. I turned to the old woman and said, "No. I'm taking us home."